Denis. It's a pleasure to welcome you to Austin, and you've been here many times before. You're a rather special breed of musician, and we talked before we started recording this interview about exactly how to describe you two, because you don't fit in any of the usual categories when you're describing musicians. So perhaps I'll ask you again to explain exactly what it is you do and whether you could encapsulate your activities under one title. Well, in fact, Rex, you mentioned that you thought up one for the British census.
Yes, I describe myself as a concert pianolist. People who play the pianola were pianolists, and there used to be a lot of them around 100 years ago. And people talk of being a concert pianist, so that seemed a perfectly sensible way of going about it. And I have to say, for the British census, which came out, we had to fill it in about 2 weeks ago, I thought, well, they might as well at least have one person in the whole of the country who's described as a concert pianolist, and then in 100 years' time, when these things become public again, somebody can look through and that'll make them really scratch their heads. But I don't know, I would say you need some other term to describe us, I suppose. What would you think?
I mean, my particular interest is in reproducing pianos. If in current terminology, if I said I was a performance practice enthusiast, that might mean something to some people. I'm interested in the historical performances which have been preserved on piano roll and which can be replayed in a quite remarkably vivid way with properly restored instruments.
I would say one thing, since we're down here in Austin, Texas, and of course we both live in London, England. Dennis and I, it always strikes me, are very lucky. We live about 20 minutes away from each other, and we see each other almost every day, drive in one direction or the other. The nearest person after our 20-minute drive is to come and visit Ken in Austin. There are very, very few people in the world who are so heavily into the music of the instruments, I would say. And it is greatly to our advantage that we're so close, because I'm always telling Denis how badly his pianos are playing in order to encourage him to do better. And he's always hitting me, telling me I'm being rude.
I think Ken would like to be a bit closer to other enthusiasts, but 4,000 miles is rather a long way away.
That's interesting that you describe yourself as being interested in period performance, because the instruments that you work with are obsolete now for practical purposes. There was a time in the early part of the 20th century when these instruments were popular, piano rolls were being made, instruments themselves were being bought, but the instruments were overtaken by newer technology. Am I correct in that?
Yes, they became outmoded when electrical gramophone, phonograph recording came in 1925, and then the radio became popular. And then, of course, you weren't limited only to piano music. You had orchestral, vocal, and so on. And these new media were much cheaper and didn't require the constant maintenance that the player pianos and reproducing pianos.
That's where you come in, and very few other people like you in the world, as you've said, that there were a fair number of instruments produced that would play the piano rolls, but of course with the coming of the electrical microphone, radio, newer technology later still, the old instruments fell into disrepair. So somebody had to teach themselves. I would think it wasn't an easy way of learning from somebody, and bring these instruments back to life so you could play the rolls. The rolls survived without, I guess, much care, but the instruments were the real problem.
Yes, and I would say, I always feel this, I get attacked for it a little bit sometimes, but I would say since the Second World War, player pianos on the whole have been the preserve of collectors. And I think very frequently collectors, when they amass great collections of things, they don't collect them for the reasons that the original owners had them. You don't find collectors having huge collections of player pianos in order to make music on them. Because why would you want so many? If you want to make music, you would just have 3 or 4 perhaps, but you wouldn't have a lot. And there are people who collect art case pianos. Well, that doesn't make any difference to the way the piano sounds. And generally speaking, it seems to me that the repertoire associated with player pianos has come to be defined by the musical tastes of people who've collected them since the Second War. And that has tended to mean ragtime, jazz, and simple music generally, not the stuff which they were perhaps made for. That's distorted our view of them. And the other aspect of that, I think, also is that since people have by and large not been interested in the music, the instruments have not played well. And you only have, in my view, to look at YouTube. You can find thousands of awful player piano performances on that. Now, there are some reproducing piano performances which are not so bad, perhaps, but certainly the player piano ones, the sort of instrument that I play, there are any number of totally thoughtless performances, some indeed played and commented on by people who try and give the impression that they're being authoritative, which is even worse. And of course musicologists and people who are studying these things have no way of knowing that that isn't true. And with great regret, I have to say that the sort of direction I've tried to work in for most of my life has been more or less completely undone by YouTube, I would say. And it's very difficult fighting a rearguard action against that because there's only one or two of them.
Well, perhaps we ought to try to clarify the distinction between reproducing pianos and player pianos. You're more involved, Rex, in the player pianos. You actually take part in performances that are live, and you actually have to be a participant. Whereas with the reproducing pianos, in most cases we're taking piano rolls that were done years ago, often by very famous pianists of the period and composers. Rachmaninoff comes to mind, certainly, Ravel, Debussy, many others. But there we're trying to preserve the way they played, and we do that, I guess, not only with the piano roll, but by having an instrument that's going to reproduce the piano roll at the highest possible level, correct?
Yes, you were talking about the instruments becoming obsolete. The pianos which we have to deal with, well, they were built between, say, 1905 and 1930. The results can only be good as the actual quality of the piano itself. And I have to say, being of an older generation, I don't look on these instruments, the actual pianos and the tone of the instruments, as being old-fashioned. But I learned a lot when I was in my 20s and 30s from an old piano technician who was 70-odd, 80-odd at that time, and I think I have a good idea of how these pianos should be made to sound in the way of treating the hammers, setting up the action and so on. And once one has achieved that, then one can start setting up the rebuilding the mechanism to replay the rolls. But yes, you're right, the instrument has to be right. Modern pianos are much more powerful generally and generally louder, and I would say rather less subtle than the old ones, but they are a different breed of instrument and they're not as suitable for reproducing recordings made, say, in 1910 or